Professor Brown has spoken of three pillars underpinning sustainable transitions to the adoption of water-sensitive principles. Cognitive, or getting all stakeholders to think about and embrace water-sensitive technologies. Normative shifts, getting people or the community to value the benefits of water-sensitive cities. And putting in place rules or regulations or legislation to facilitate or provide for water-sensitive processes. Let's look at the challenge of getting stakeholders to think about adopting water-sensitive design approaches. What's the main challenge here? An essential part of getting stakeholder and community involvement in water-sensitive planning processes requires the development of a shared vision of the future to meet the social and biophysical challenges of the future. Dr. Bryony Rogers from Monash University takes up this story.
Professor Brown has introduced the wide range of human dimensions that need to be considered when we're asking the question of how do we transition to a water-sensitive city. We know that it's very radical shifts that need to occur in terms of the technologies that are implemented, how they're embedded in the urban landscape, the types of institutional rules that need to be followed. So our system is becoming a lot more complex. Many different actors need to be involved. Communities and citizens have a greater role to play in terms of being empowered to help transition to a water-sensitive city. Different professions need to come together and work in new ways together, collaboratively. And this all adds up to being quite transformative change that needs to occur. Now, these shifts are not going to happen within a 5-year timeframe. We're talking about long-term horizons. Becoming a water-sensitive city might take 10, 20, 30, 50 years. So what cities and practitioners and policymakers need to do is to think about, well, how do we strategically plan to get to that water-sensitive city? So when we're talking about strategic planning, it's getting collective shared visions, shared ideas around what's our goals, what do we want to be achieving, and then what are the strategies that we need to put in place to be able to get there. If we think about how urban water systems have been planned traditionally, they've really been about how do we guarantee adequate water supply, adequate sanitation, adequate flood protection for a growing population under assumed rainfalls based on historical data. We could almost describe that as a command and control approach, having certainty around what we can predict about the future. If we think about planning for a water-sensitive city, we're now starting to consider this wide range of goals and objectives, the many different needs that communities have of their water system, right through those relatedness and growth needs that Professor Brown talked about. This means that there's a large amount of uncertainty that we need to be able to consider and accommodate when we plan our water systems for the future. Planning for a water-sensitive city requires us to look forward to the future. We need to think about where we want to be in 50 years' time, where we want our grandchildren to be playing in their landscape and in their neighbourhoods. That means that we need to have a shared vision. Scenario planning is a contemporary approach in the scientific field to help people come together and think through these future scenarios. Where do we want to be? What's our preferred future vision? The other element of planning for the future is that it's very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen with the climate. We don't know what's going to happen with our population. We don't know how our city is really going to develop. So we need to be developing resilient futures as well. And as we think about our strategies for transitioning to a water-sensitive city, we want to make sure they're robust. So no matter how the future unfolds, we can still achieve our shared future vision of a water-sensitive city. Strategic planning using these scenario techniques to get to our preferred vision in a resilient way involves a few different steps. We first need to understand what the current situation is, what are our current challenges, what are the barriers that we need to overcome, including some of the ones that Professor Brown mentioned. We then need to go through an envisioning process, fleshing out, really exploring with different stakeholders what those goals, the multiple objectives are of a water-sensitive city. Then a process of backcasting. Backcasting is about starting from that future vision with our planning and working backwards. What do we need to do 40 years from now, 30 years, 20 years, so that we have a map, a pathways forward to be able to get to the water-sensitive city. But we need to think about that not just from an ideal perspective, this is ideally what we would like to do, but what happens when situations get challenging, when crises occur? when different shocks and stresses and changes in our context means that that pathway might be challenged. Some research we did in Melbourne identified a range of different wildcards, we called them. That was about identifying what are the things that might disrupt these pathways that will help us navigate to the water-sensitive city. So these wildcards might be challenges. It could be prolonged drought, a big flood, it could be some political change, many different things, but it could also be positive. A new technology might be invented that will completely change the game in terms of how our water infrastructure operates. So these shocks and stresses and extremes, they could be negative and challenging, but they could also be positive. So we need to implement processes to anticipate them so that we're ready and prepared to take advantage of the windows of opportunity that they will open for us.